Hello, everybody. Welcome to another fraught edition of the Anthony Peak Consciousness Hour. It seems to be an ongoing problem we have. When we start, I turn around and I say to Zoom, just go live and out to everybody, but it seems to default to friends. So all you friends out there that are friends of mine, you get this embarrassing start to these, which nobody else sees, which is probably a relief. I don't think we swore this time. I got frustrated, but it's one of those things. Right. Welcome again to the Anthony Peak Consciousness Hour. Today's guest is somebody I've been wanting to interview for many, many years, because Dr. Steve Taylor is somebody I've known for many, many years. You know, when you meet somebody and you get on with them extremely well, this is what happened to Steve and I. I think it was probably around about 15 years ago, where we both spoke at the annual get-together of the Scientific and Medical Network, which that particular one took place in Manchester. And we got chatting about various issues, and we discovered we both had a fascinating interest in time. And it was at that time, pun intended, that Steve pointed out to me about his amazing book on time called Making Time, which is here. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. It was an excellent piece of work. And since then, I've been following Steve's career with great interest. We both now are Watkins authors as well, so we share a lot in common in that way as well. And we're both from the northwest of England, so we have that in common. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Steve's background for a second, and then we'll get into chatting, and then I'll introduce Steve to you properly. I'll be looking to the side because I'm not very good at just talking off the top of my head and reading. Well, actually, I'm not bad at talking off the top of my head. I do it all the time, but nevertheless, I will read this anyway. Okay, so Steve teaches psychology and society at Leeds Beckett University and is the module leader for consciousness studies and positive psychology. Steve's background is transpersonal psychology and positive psychology. He has published 7 books. His book Making Time deals with his ideas and research on time perception. Out of the Darkness details his research on the transformational after effects of facing turmoil and trauma. Other books include The Fall, Waking from Sleep, and Back to Sanity. Steve's journal articles have been published in over 40 academic journals, magazines and newspapers, including the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. His work has been featured widely in the media on the UK, including the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, on BBC Breakfast, BBC World TV, Radio 4 and 5, and The Guardian and The Independent. So Steve really is somebody that's quite a media darling as well, which is absolutely excellent. I know I've been checking his regular write-ups that he does. They're very, very interesting, so I strongly suggest I check them out. Steve, welcome to the Anthony Peak Consciousness Hour.
Hi, Anthony. It's great to see you again. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. It's absolutely wonderful to do so. Very, very much, Steve. Before we get into a little bit of the background of the general questions, how did you get into it? You did your degree and PhD, I think, at Liverpool John Moores. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, but originally I did English at university when I was a young man. But then I had a long time out from academia. I was a musician for a long time. I did a lot of kind of mundane jobs, sort of living a hand-to-mouth existence. But when I found out about transpersonal psychology, I decided to go back to university.
So how did you find out about it? How did it? It's not something you just bump into on the number 68 bus, is it?
By the time I was sort of 29, 30 years old, I'd already started a career as an author. I'd already decided I wanted to be an author, and I'd been writing fiction before then, but I decided to start writing non-fiction. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I started writing about psychology and spirituality, which were my main interests, I started to, it started to get a lot easier. Things started to be published quite easily. And I published my first book with a small publisher in 2003. So after that, I realized that the field of psychology I was interested in was actually a field called transpersonal psychology. And I found out about it through reading Ken Wilber, who you're probably aware of. That was the first time, I think it was about 1997, I was reading one of his books, and I heard the term transpersonal psychology for the first time. And I thought, wow, yeah, this is me. This is what I'm interested in. This is where I belong. So I decided to go back to university, and I went to Liverpool John Moores University to do an MSc, and then a PhD in transpersonal psychology.
Oh, right. Were you there with Les Lancaster then?
I was, yeah. He was my tutor. Yeah, I'm still very close to Les. I do some work for him. He runs an online master's degree, and I do some teaching on that. at the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, wonderful man. His work on the Kabbalah is extraordinary, and he used to live around the corner from when I used to live on the Wirral. We
Oh, of
used,
course,
yeah,
yeah. I think he
and
still lives on the Wirral.
he
Yeah.
does, yeah. We used to meet in a pub called the Three Stags.
Oh, right.
It's really, really nice. I really miss him. Do give him my regards next time you see him, and say I'd love
Yeah,
to
we'll
meet up with
do.
him again. Okay, well, that's a little bit about transpersonal psychology. We'll get a little bit more into that as we progress. But let's just jump straight in. I mean, your recent book, Spiritual Science, what exactly do you mean by spiritual science?
Well, the book is really, it was partly a critique of mainstream materialist science. And I try to show that materialism, which is the belief that the fundamental reality of the universe is matter and physical forces, I suggest that that worldview cannot actually explain reality very well. If you look into detail, then materialism, it explains very little. You know, it doesn't explain consciousness. It can't explain the effect of the mind on the body. It can't explain things like near-death experiences, spiritual experiences. It certainly can't explain psi experiences. It can't even explain evolution properly, and it certainly can't account for quantum physics. So I suggest that we need a new kind of science, which is not based on materialist principles. So I suggest that if you replace the idea that matter is the fundamental reality with the idea that spirit is the fundamental reality, well, I call it fundamental consciousness, or spirit, you could also call it. But if you posit the idea that the fundamental reality of the universe is consciousness or spirit, then things begin to make a lot more sense. So in the book, I try to account for things like consciousness, psi experiences, the effect of the mind on the body, evolution, altruism. All of these things I try to explain from the perspective of spirit. And I call it Pan-Spiritism, which is the idea that, you know, spirit is the fundamental reality of the universe, and spirit is everywhere and in everything.
Yeah, because that's very much the concept, really, isn't it, of panpsychism and similar concepts there. You know, the idea that matter is created by consciousness, and we know from quantum physics, you know, that the collapse of the wave function is self-evident of the fact that there is a direct relationship between consciousness and reality itself.
Yeah.
But do you think then the billion-dollar question then is, you know, the as David Chalmers said famously in the 1990s, the hard problem of science, you know, that how can science and consciousness be explained
Mm.
within the brain? I mean, do you think consciousness can be explained by simple brain processes? And
Not
could you
at
give us
all.
a little
No, I
bit of
mean,
examples about this?
sorry, what's that?
Some examples about this, how you think about these things?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to explain consciousness purely in terms of brain processes. I mean, people have been trying to do this for maybe 30 years now, and there's been very little progress. And I think the more research people do, the more mismatches we find between brain processes and consciousness. There are lots of kind of inconsistencies. Obviously, the brain is associated with consciousness, but at the same time, there are lots of inconsistencies. Things like states of coma when people are actually incredibly conscious, acutely conscious, even when there is very little brain activity, minimal brain activity. Also, near-death experiences when people are, you know, showing no brain activity, but they continue to be acutely conscious. And there are lots of other reasons. There are lots of cases where people have been found to have very little brain matter, 5 or 10% of the normal brain matter, and at the same time they've been conscious in a normal way. They've lived a fairly normal life.
That's interesting. Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
I presume here one of the cases we're talking about here is John Lauber.
I'm not sure. I'm not. Maybe I'm not familiar with that case.
Okay, John Lauber was he was, I think, a brain surgeon, I think, in Sheffield or somewhere like that in Yorkshire, and he came across a young lad who had got a first class honours degree in mathematics, and he died under tragic circumstances. And when they did the autopsy, they found that effectively he had no brain matter. He had the dura around the sides of his brain, but effectively
Mm,
his brain wasn't there. And that was the
right.
argument, wasn't it? You know, I mean, have you got any examples yourself like that of how it is that this can be?
Well, nobody really knows. I mean, one of the most famous cases of a French guy. He was a civil servant married with 2 kids, and he had a brain scan for the first time in his life at the age of 40. And it was found that in a very similar way, all his brain matter was kind of condensed into the edges of his brain, and there was a massive hole where the brain should normally be. And it was found that he only had maybe 10%, 10 to 15% of the normal brain matter. But up to that point, he'd been completely normal. You know, he'd lived a completely normal existence. So nobody really knows how this can occur, but it does seem to suggest that there is no direct association between the brain and consciousness. You know, if the brain is literally directly and consistently associated with consciousness, then things like that should not happen. So I think it points towards another view, which is that the brain's role is not to produce consciousness, but the brain's role is to channel or mediate consciousness being something beyond the brain, something which is fundamental in the universe. And, you know, the brain, I think the role of the brain is to transmit and receive consciousness. It picks up this fundamental consciousness and it channels it into my individual being or your individual being, so that we become, you know, channels of this fundamental consciousness. I think that's why, you know, a lot of people have spiritual experiences or mystical experiences in which they feel that they are one with the universe, they are one with other human beings or the living beings of the whole cosmos. And I think that is a direct experience of the unity of our individual consciousness with the fundamental consciousness of the universe.
Because that's such an important point, isn't it? You know, the idea, I mean, they come down and they say, oh, you know, it's sort of water on the brain and everything else as well. But that doesn't explain it. And it always intrigues me as to why it is that these black swans or white crows are just completely ignored by materialist reductionist science. They don't seem to like these things, you know. And yet for years, you know, you had C.D. Broad writing about this idea of the brain as a receiver or the brain as an attenuator. You had Aldous Huxley doing it. But modern materialist reductionism, they hate it, don't they? So because they can't explain it, they compartmentalize it and put it away somewhere. So do you think these days, with the way in which we're now understanding quantum mechanics, the way we're understanding neurology in greater detail, do you think now there's a change going on in terms of materialism losing its grip on modern culture?
I do. I think if you compare it to, say, 20 years ago, I think maybe the year 2000 was the kind of apex of materialism. And it was when everybody seemed to think that human behavior could be explained wholly in terms of genes. You know, there was a gene for shopping, a gene for football,
Gene for Levi's,
a gene for everything. Yeah. And, you know, and it was kind of taken for granted that human beings are genetic robots and there's no other way of explaining human existence. Consciousness is just a product of the brain. People were convinced that in a number of years we would explain how the brain gives rise to consciousness. But it hasn't happened. You know, the Genome Project, was it in about 2003, 2004, around that time? It was a kind of a bit of a damp squib. It didn't really help us very much. It didn't really explain things like human traits, human behavior, the differences between individual human beings, or even the differences between human beings and other species, even the differences between human beings and tomatoes, you know, or mice. So I think since then, there's been a gradual diminishing of the power of materialism over our culture. And I think it's even, you know, I work in academia, so I can sense what's happening within the world of academia. I think even within that realm, which is kind of like the bastion of materialism, even within that realm, it's beginning to ebb away. Maybe it's partly because of the wider global problems that we're facing at the moment. I think there's a general realization that the materialistic way of life is a product of materialism as a culture, as a worldview. And since materialism as a way of life is so destructive, I think people are beginning to sense that materialism as a philosophy does not work and that we need to go beyond it to a more holistic and more spiritual view of reality.
I think that's so true. You know, the concept of promissory materialism, the idea that we can't understand how the brain works at the moment, but we sure as hell will know in 20 or 30 years. When effectively, you know, mind and spirit, brain and spirit are completely different things. You know, that we're talking chalk and cheese. We have no idea how it is that a non-physical spiritual something can affect the wanting to move my arm. But by the same token, you know, as you and I are both aware, you know, we were talking about Les Lancaster earlier on, you know, the Department of Transpersonal Psychology at John Moores University, I think, did it close or something? Because I know that there were issues there. So clearly, were they happy within the psychology department to have such a department within the university?
Yeah, I think there was some opposition from the dean. You think he maybe thought it was a bit too way out, a bit too esoteric. But I think the main thing was that Les Lancaster was retiring,
Right.
and so I think they took the opportunity to close it down gently, with his retirement.
Can you tell us a little bit more? I'm really interested in this, because you're in academia, in terms of what you're seeing. What evidence are you seeing from other subjects that make you believe that this groundswell is building up? Because I'm really interested in this.
Well, we could look at evolutionary biology, for example. I mean, 20 years ago, I think it was also the heyday of neo-Darwinism, the idea that evolution could be wholly explained in terms of natural selection and random mutations, promoted by people like Richard Dawkins. And, a lot of people did assume it was the reality that that we had accounted for evolution. But since then, people have begun to, they've found a lot of anomalies, and they've begun to discover that neo-Darwinism cannot explain evolution particularly well. There's this thing in evolution called adaptive mutation, which explains that mutations don't just occur randomly. They seem to occur when they are needed, when they are required. So, mutations are not just accidental. In some bizarre way, they occur when they are supposed to occur. And people have begun to realize that mutations occur at such a level of frequency, which is way beyond any kind of randomness. They seem to occur when they are needed in a kind of coherent pattern, as if there is some kind of organizing force behind evolution. And that 20 years ago, that would have sounded a bit far out, but now it's become almost mainstream. There's a movement called the third way in evolution, which has attracted many prominent biologists and evolutionary theorists. And their idea is that you can't explain evolution in terms of neo-Darwinism, and you can't explain it in terms of creationism. So you need a third way. So they're trying to sort of forge a new view of evolution, which takes in things such as epigenetics.
Can you just explain for the audience what you mean when you use the term epigenetics?
Epigenetics, it sort of harks back to, there was this guy called Lamarck, who was kind of like an early theorist of evolution. And his idea was that living beings, his idea was that evolution is not random, it's somehow purposive. And that once a living being develops certain characteristics in their lifetime, they can pass on those characteristics to future generations. And that's not possible at all in terms of neo-Darwinism. It's the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that used to be a kind of a blasphemous idea. It was a kind of ridiculous idea. Everyone thought it was completely absurd. But epigenetics shows that if you undergo a certain change within your lifetime, due to environmental factors, maybe if you go through a long period of hunger or starvation, obviously that brings some biological changes, then those biological changes can be passed on to your offspring. So it brings in this kind of environmental aspect into evolution, which wasn't present before.
That is fascinating, isn't it? And that's such an important development. It's almost teleological in it. It's the idea that there is an underlying reason for evolution, and evolution has a plan, which then suggests that there is a form of plan. I'm reminded here of the cosmic anthropic principle. And the ideas there, that the universe in some way is hardwired for the evolution of sentient beings that are able to observe. In other words, the universe has planned to create consciousness. But of course, there is the worry there. And you're quite right. We need a third way, don't we? Because you have the creationists. And I know that people like you and I, people will accuse us in some way of being apologists for Christianity or apologists for creationism. And that's not the case, is it? It's not what we're saying. No.
No, a lot of people think that there is a binary choice between science and religion. And by science, they mean mainstream materialist science. So if you don't believe in evolution in the traditional sense, if you don't believe in neo-Darwinist evolution, then you must be a creationist. And if you believe in, if you're open to the possibility of life after death, then you have to be religious. There's no other way of explaining it. You're either an atheist or you're religious. But I think we occupy this kind of middle ground, which is really a third way. Well, I sometimes refer to it as, transmaterialist or post-materialist. So, obviously, like you, I've got nothing against science. I love science. I see myself as a scientist, but I don't see myself as a materialist scientist. I see myself as a post-materialist. I see myself as occupying a kind of different domain, I use the term spiritual science, but obviously there is a belief system which is associated with mainstream science. You could call it scientism, but it's basically materialism. And many people assume that if you are scientific, then you have to be also a materialist, but that's not the case.
I think, more and more the group of us that are involved in this work, we need to work more closely together on this, because I think this third way is the way forward. And it is so important because it's more ecological, it's more human. Human is the wrong term, but it is probably more attuned to what is really taking place, because you feel, don't you? Because I feel sometimes that people are attacking me from the religious groups or the extreme believers in anything spiritual, the real extreme believers. They don't like what we're doing, but neither do the hardline scientists. And all we're doing is, I sometimes feel we're on this bridge and everybody's throwing stones at us. And all we're saying is just look at the evidence. Please just look at the scientific evidence first,
Yeah. It's quite remarkable because, if you look into near-death experiences, there are so many materialist explanations or attempts to explain near-death experiences in terms of the release of endorphins, a lack of oxygen to the brain, depersonalization. There are probably 15 or 20 popular theories of materialist theories of near-death experiences, but none of them, are really viable. None of them really, hold much water if you look into them in detail. And they do, and when there are so many theories about one particular phenomenon, then it suggests that the assumptions underlying the theories are wrong. It suggests that you need to change the assumption underlying these theories. Yeah. But nobody wants to do that because it would suggest a different view of reality.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, for instance, the subject I'm fascinated in, which we'll touch on a bit about time perception in a second, is Deja Vu. And there are 72 different explanations quoted in a recent book on Deja Vu, including my own, by the way, so I'm one of those 72. And clearly, as you say, if there are so many attempts to explain it, it means that there's a problem there. But we seem to have thrown, the scientists love using this term Occam's razor, and you've got to apply Occam's razor to things. When you do, the simple solution is normally the answer. So why don't you go back and look and ask the people who've had the near-death experiences, what did you experience? They experience, moving out of the body and have veridical experiences and everything else as well. Or people have deja vu, feel that they're seeing the future. Why don't you just listen to them? Use the term empiricism, from experience. As you rightly say, the term scientism, it's a religious belief. And if anything doesn't fit in, you erode your academic tenure, don't you? I mean, do you find that you come across any academics that really have problems with what you do now? Or are they, as I said, I'm asking the same question again, but really intrigues me.
Interestingly, not so much. I think it's kind of waning. I think secretly a lot of scientists are probably open to some of these ideas, but they're unwilling to display their openness because they know that they may lose tenure or lose funding.
Do you ever have it? I have this, and I'll do a talk and I'll have scientists and I'll do an event with them, and they're hardline anti everything I talk about, and then we'll sit down after a beer and we'll have a couple of beers and they'll go, yeah, no, what you talk about is total nonsense, but I've never been able to explain this. And they give you this example. And you look at them and you go, well, can you explain that? No. Did it really happen to you? Yes. Doesn't that make you think? And the thing is, maybe when I've retired, I'll write about this. But I can't be seen to do it at the moment.
Interestingly, I did meet a psychologist probably about 6 or 7 years ago. I won't mention his name because you may have heard of him. But he's quite a well-known psychologist. But a kind of mainstream psychologist at a top university, a very prominent figure within the world of psychology, maybe not so well known to a popular audience.
We guess.
Yeah, let's do 20 questions.
You can guess, but I won't tell you whether you're right or not.
All right.
Is he tall?
No, not at all.
Does he wear glasses?
Is he short?
It's like Guess Who.
Does he have a moustache? Sorry, Steve, we're being silly again. Sorry, can we? Okay.
Anyway, he was giving a talk at a conference I went to. And he was speaking about William James, William James, the great psychologist, one of my heroes, who was interested in mystical experiences. And he was talking about William James's theory of mystical experiences based on the varieties of religious experience. Then he started talking about psi phenomena. And I went up to him afterwards and said, I had no idea you were interested in these things. And he said, yeah, well, I was always interested in these things, but I never showed it to anybody because I was always afraid I'd lose my job. You know, I was afraid that I wouldn't get papers published or I wouldn't get funding for my research. So, you know, now I've retired, I've decided to be open about these things, which is great. But at the same time, it's a shame that you had to wait that long. You know, I think it's more effective if you can work from within the, if you can be like a Trojan horse, you can get into the arena, you can get into the city of academia, and then you can start to, throw bombs within the, that's the wrong analogy. You can start to cause trouble.
I think we need people like you, Steve, as our Trojan horses. By the way, just a very quick point. I was pointing out to Sarah, does anybody see the spot on the end of my nose? It's not really there. I feel like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Now I'm looking at myself and going, oh my God, it's even worse.
About bringing that up, Anthony, easily.
I know. Well, I thought I had to because people would probably be pointing it out anyway. Sarah, have you got any comments or anything coming from the chat room or anything you want before we move on to the next subject?
David Wood did ask what are Steve's thoughts regarding artificial intelligence and transhumanism and how the human race might develop as a result of those kinds of technological innovations.
I'm quite skeptical about it, to be honest. I don't think there's any possibility of artificially creating human consciousness. I think anything that you can simulate is literally just a simulation. It's not the real thing. You can develop, something that seems conscious, that seems to be intelligent in the same way that human beings are, but it won't be genuinely conscious in the same way that human beings are. It will not have experience. It will just have a kind of simulation of experience. So I don't think it's an avenue worth pursuing, to be honest. And there are, I think the most essential human qualities are things like empathy, compassion, spirituality, and I don't think we'll ever be able to, generate those artificially.
I think that's the issue, isn't it? It's the substrate problem. The idea of what, if you just add 2 or 3 more molecules, does consciousness just spontaneously occur? And the idea that a machine could even pass the Turing test, to see whether it had thought, but you could never prove. Isn't it? In question, no. It's the question in philosophy, the problem of other minds, isn't it? We can't, can we? We'll never know, and it's arrogance to think that we can create sentient life, because that's effectively what it would mean, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's going back to Frankenstein, isn't it?
Yeah. Sorry, Sarah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that I can imagine transhumanism being a kind of slow process of human augmentation. When we start off with devices and implants, and then out of that we kind of co-evolve with technology. And I do think, because one of the big things now is longevity science, and I do think if people are living for like 100 years, that there's going to be a sort of different appreciation of life or understanding of life, or more time to do things, which may lead to interesting developments within humanity.
That's interesting. There was a famous play by Bernard Shaw called Back to Methuselah. And that was his idea. His idea was that human beings live such short lifespans that we can't develop properly. But if you expand our lifetime to 300 years, then we can become fully mature. We have the time to develop properly.
Because that is a very good point, isn't it? That I find, you get to my great age or whatever, is that you acquire wisdom and you spend all your life acquiring knowledge, but it's only when you get older you're able to apply it, because you've experienced your youth, you've experienced your middle age, you've experienced your 40s and your 50s, and you get into your 60s and you can look back on it. But then you realise, I've only got a few more years to use this knowledge before Alzheimer's and everything takes away our abilities. And I think that may be the way forward, possibly. Which brings us beautifully into the book that first brought us both together, in terms of Making Time, your very first book. And I do stress to people, I think this is the perfect companion novel to my own Labyrinth of Time. They work together incredibly well as books. So can you tell us a little bit why time so interests you? What is it about time, as it were?
It's partly the result of my interest in higher states of consciousness, or altered states of consciousness, because in those altered states, time is one of the primary things which changes. In altered states of consciousness, whether they're induced by meditation, by psychedelics, by sport, or by accidents or emergencies, they always bring a shift in time perception, and usually time slows down quite drastically. And I've always been fascinated by those moments when, seconds turn into minutes, time slows down in an incredibly dramatic way. It often happens in accidents. I had a car accident about 6 years ago, and it kind of re-energized my interest in time, really, because during that period of a few seconds, time slowed down radically, and I felt as though I had loads of time to try to take some preventative action. And all the cars around me seemed to be moving incredibly slowly. Everything looked strangely kind of serene and beautiful, and this strange sense of calmness overcame me. So even though I was, in reality, I was quite close to death on the motorway at 70 miles an hour, but I felt this tremendous sense of calmness and, this sense of, being able to take the time to take some preventative action. And that's very common. I'm sure lots of people listening to this have had that experience. It's very common in accidents. It also happens in psychedelics. Psychedelics are famous for their slowing down of time. So as a result of that, I've always been interested in the connection between consciousness and time perception. It seems to be the case, as I'm sure you'd agree, that our normal perception of time is just a kind of a faculty of our normal consciousness. So as soon as you shift into a different state of consciousness, your time perception changes. And it seems to suggest that time is, well, you could say it's an illusion. It's certainly it's something that's flexible, something which is never absolute or objective. It's something which is so flexible that it seems to be, a kind of mental construct, and even perhaps even an illusion altogether.
Because that's interesting, isn't it? Time slowing down under times of stress. I don't know if you're aware of the work of David Eagleman in America.
Yeah.
Because that's intriguing, isn't it? The work he did in terms of maybe we could chat about that for a second.
That's intriguing, but I actually wrote about him in a recent paper. I wrote a paper about time expansion experiences.
All right.
That's what I call them. So I collected about 90 examples from people of these time expansion experiences, and I analysed the main characteristics of the experiences and the situations when they occurred. So most of them were accidents, but there were also psychedelics, there were meditation experiences, and some other kinds of experiences. Sport as well was quite a big one. So yeah, I mean, one thing I found that was different from David Eagleman is that people were convinced that it was a real time experience. It was a real experience, not a memory, because he suggests that time expansion is a kind of illusory memory. It comes through recollection.
Yes.
Only when you think about it afterwards. But I mean, almost everybody I spoke to was firmly convinced that wasn't the case. And that was partly because they had this feeling that they had time to take some preventative action. And obviously that wouldn't be the case if it was just a memory. They actually felt as though they had more time to act. And in sport, having more time gave them an advantage over their opponents and led to better performances.
They were the sections of your book I found quite fascinating when I first read it. Was the sports examples. Because it's as if players, when they get in the zone, they have time to really calculate and decide, like tennis players, where exactly to put the ball. And I think you're quite right. I think Eagleman's experiments are very interesting and very fascinating, but he's missing the point, isn't he, in so many ways, because he's coming from a materialist reductionist viewpoint. He's refusing to listen to what people are saying to him. And I will guarantee there's going to be lots of people out there. And guys, if you have had experiences of time slowing down, I'd be fascinated to hear from you. And I'm sure Steve would love to hear from you as
definitely.
well on this, because it's an area we are both absolutely fascinated in. What is taking place there? And, have you evidence that you were able to manipulate your environment because you had the advantage of this? I mean, in my new book, I'm going to have a section on something called the Zeitraffer Phenomenon, which is when individuals feel that time speeds up. And again, that is fascinating again, isn't it? The idea that time is the only thing we can measure by itself. We can have a pound of apples, but you have a minute of a minute, and I don't know that your minute is the same as my minute.
No.
And it's a fascinating topic, isn't it? I think we've got here, Steve, and I think we must do this, Sarah. I think we have a whole incon with Steve and myself discussing time, because I think the subject can go on and on, and we're going to run out of time because we only have an hour today in terms of just an introduction to your work. But so your new book, which is out shortly, it's called Extraordinary Awakenings. What's that about? Where are you going with your work now?
This is it's a long-standing interest of mine in the transformational potential of extreme psychological turmoil. So for my new book, I did a lot of interviews with people who've been through incredibly intense suffering of one form or another. So, for example, soldiers who were, fighting for their lives or were facing death on the battlefield, prisoners who'd been incarcerated for many years, some people in prison camps, Soviet gulags, for example. Also, people who've been through bereavement, people who've been diagnosed with cancer, people who've been through long periods of severe addiction, and so forth. But what all of these people have in common is that they went through a profound personal transformation in the midst of incredibly intense suffering. And it usually happened at the moment when they had lost everything, when they were completely broken down. So in terms of addiction, it's when people bottom out, when there's nothing left, they're completely broken down. And that is usually the point where transformation occurs. And it's quite a miraculous transformation, which I don't fully understand. It's so strange, so miraculous, that I don't think it can be completely explained.
Can you tell us more? Because this is again intriguing. Your work is fascinating. Yeah. So can you tell us more? I'm sure everybody out there is. I want to know more about this.
I'll give you a brief example. There was one woman I spoke to called Eve from Edinburgh in Scotland. And she was a really severe alcoholic for 29 years. And eventually she'd lost everything. She was living on the streets. All the friends and family had broken contact with her. She was just living from the next drink to the next, begging on the streets, going shoplifting to get money for alcohol. And, there was basically nothing left. She was a wreck. She was just 6 stone. She was barely eating, just drinking all the time. And she finally reached the point where she just decided that she was going to commit suicide. There's no point carrying on because she couldn't stop drinking. As soon as she tried to stop drinking, she got these terrible, paranoid states of mind and felt incredibly physically, ill when she tried to stop drinking. So she didn't see any way out. So she decided to commit suicide. And she knew that there was a bus going from Glasgow to Edinburgh at a certain time every day. So she went to that point on the road and she jumped in front of the coach going from Glasgow to Edinburgh. But luckily the coach driver swerved, so she wasn't killed. And the police were called, and rather than arresting her, the policeman said, what can I do? Can I take you to see somebody? Is there anywhere I can take you? Can I take you to see your parents? So the policeman took her to her parents' house, and she hadn't seen them for many years. They were kind of, she'd been ostracized by her parents. But her mother took her in, and her mother said, well, you're an alcoholic. I'll have to give you a drink, won't I? And she said, yeah. So her mother gave her a glass of red wine, and she picked up the glass, and then another part of her put it down again. She kept picking up the glass and then putting it down again. She had no idea why. But then she went to a mirror. Her mother actually took her to the mirror and said, look at you, you're an alcoholic, just look at yourself. And she said that she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She thought, who is that person in the mirror? I don't know who that is. And she knew that something had drastically changed inside her. She felt like a different person in her body. And anyway, the doctor came. The doctor knocked her out for a couple of days to get her through the withdrawal symptoms of alcohol. And when she came round 2 days later, she felt different somehow. She felt that she was somehow a different person in the same body. And the strangest thing was that the craving for alcohol had just gone. She had no more desire to drink. And she continued to have that feeling when she looked in the mirror. She didn't know who she was. She felt like she was a different person. And somehow a new identity had emerged inside her at the moment of rock bottom. Somehow in the process of attempting suicide and failing to commit suicide, something had changed really fundamentally. And it was almost as if, in all of these cases, it's almost as if a new self is born inside people. The way I explain it is that the old ego self dies, it kind of dissolves away. I think that's why people reach a state of desolation, because all of their psychological attachments which sustain their normal sense of ego are broken down, and there's nothing left. They're completely lost, completely broken down, which is a terrible state to be in, but it's also potentially a transformative state, because when the normal ego breaks down, then a new self, a kind of latent higher self, seems to arise and to take the place of the ego. So it's very mysterious, but it's a kind of miraculous shift in identity. It's a spiritual awakening, basically, and that's what my new book's about. It's surprisingly common. I research these cases all the time. People write to me very frequently to tell me about their experiences of
Do
this
you know,
phenomenon.
it's almost shamanic, isn't it? You know, the idea of the shamanic, you know, sort of dismemberment idea that you have to go to extremes, and when you go to that extreme, something else seems to come outside of yourself, or you change. And I think
Yeah,
your
yeah.
point of view is a really interesting one. Sorry, Steve, go on.
Well, yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, I studied quite a few cases from the Soviet gulags, you know, from the 60s and 70s, and also the 80s. You know, the conditions in the Soviet gulags were, you know, completely appalling. People were half starved. There was no medical treatment. They were living in, you know, sub-zero temperatures all the time. It was regularly some minus 20 or minus 30. So people were living in, you know, really terrible, appalling conditions, which you'd think would break people down and kill them, which obviously it did in some cases, many cases. But there were also many cases where people, you know, in states of extreme suffering, such as that, they found something deep inside themselves, a kind of reserve of resilience, an almost spiritual power within themselves that kept them alive. Some people call it a kind of soul radiance or soul force that emerged in times of extreme deprivation, you know. And they said that this soul force would keep them warm in sub-zero temperatures, and this soul force would stop them being hungry. It would keep them alive even though they were barely eating. And this soul force would help them to recover from illnesses. So it was very strange, but you know, it's very similar to have you heard of the Indian concept of siddhis, the kind of like the psychic powers?
Yes.
Yeah. It's very similar to that, but they seem to be activated in states of extreme suffering.
Yeah, it does. You know, within the Native Americans, you know, the idea of the famous movie in the late 1930s, early 1970s, the A Man Called Horse, where he goes through an initiation ceremony where he's hung. They put things through him and they hang him and they turn him. It's as if you go into literally a state of literal ecstasis outside of yourself in order to find the inner you, or the what I would call the uber daemon, the uber eidolon, I suppose. You know, my daemon and eidolon model, and the idea that the eidolon can die within a life and be reborn again. In some form that has greater knowledge that the daemon can be involved in, because there were so many areas. It's really quite intriguing here. I don't know if you've come across the writings of a previous guest of this show, Dr. Penny Satori.
Oh yeah, I know Penny. Yeah.
No, and Penny wrote this book, didn't she? The transformative effects of near-death experiences. And in a previous show, we discussed that. And it's again this idea, isn't it? I'd never thought about this before. And it's thank you for this, Steve. It's really interesting, because I'm just literally a few days ago, I was writing up the chapter on Gnosticism again for my new book. And one of the areas I'm really focusing in on is the Gnostic idea of the shard, the part of the pleroma, the light that's trapped within the body, that's part of the greater something, the universe we're denied because we're within Maya, we're within this simulation, whatever you want to call it. And there's a part of us that is part of that greater something. And is that the greater something that maybe when we go into great suffering, that's when it wells up, isn't it? And comes into its own. Because it's so shamanic, isn't it? I'd never really thought about it before.
Yeah.
People, they're having shamanic experiences. The guys in the gulags were having shamanic experiences.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it certainly reminds me a little bit of Gurdjieff as well. You know, the Russian kind of esoteric philosopher.
Yes.
His idea was that human beings are not aware of the kind of strength and resilience inside them. That you have to be pushed to extreme circumstances in order to gain contact with these tremendous reserves of strength and resilience. So yeah, it's a bit like that. You know, I mean, the good thing about it is that, you know, it makes you realize that if you were ever in a situation where you had to face extreme suffering, I'm convinced that there is some resilience and some spiritual strength inside us all, which we would gain access to in those situations. Yeah. I also think about, you know, bereavement as well. Bereavement is quite a big trigger of spiritual awakening, of personal transformation. And if you think back, you know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, so many people, and we all go through bereavement at some point, but there were so many parents who lost children at that time. You know, infant mortality rates were so high. And the same with soldiers. There were so many soldiers who've had to fight against their will in wars throughout history. And, you know, in prisoners as well. So many people have been imprisoned against unjustly, you know, without committing any crime. So it's kind of nice to think that throughout all those, you know, all those centuries, a lot of people would have gone through some kind of transformation. They would have gained access to this spiritual strength. in the midst of that intense suffering.
Do you know, that's a lovely thing to think of, isn't it? You know, that
Yeah.
there's this extra, not advantage, but you know, that suffering can bring about this kind of magic transformation. Clearly, this is a very, very interesting and very, very exciting book, and I think very, very important for what we need. Because, as you say, we've been through the collective trauma of the last 2 years, and it's not anywhere near as bad. But you do feel sometimes, you know, that dark night of the soul you sometimes go through, where you worry and you think, oh my God, where can I go? What can I do? There's no lower I can go. And that's when the spark appears. That's when the hidden spark, the hidden light happens. Sarah, have you got any idea, any comments on this or anything? Because this is fascinating, isn't it?
There were a few things that I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about materialism, actually, that I wanted to bring up before I forget. And this idea that materialist science is ever at a point where it knows everything, which it never has been in the history of materialist science. We've never had the answer to everything. And even with regards to the human brain producing consciousness, materialist scientists are now discovering that there are neural networks spread out throughout the body. And probably there's an element of the neural networks compensating for what's lacking from the brain region in the heart and the gut and throughout the body. So, you know, and I think it's very true, like with near-death experiences, I do believe that there's some sort of spiritual survival mechanism within the NDE where a body doesn't want to go through this much trauma. So they inhabit the spirit and they come out of the body so they don't have to bodily experience that much trauma. And it brings to mind as well, dissociative identity disorder and this idea of being able to split off personalities in response to trauma. And in the cases of some people, they can even have an allergic reaction in one personality and not in the other, which I find incredible. So it just goes to show how much potential human beings actually have. And maybe if we did live to 300 years, we might come to, you know, fulfill it somehow.
Yeah. Imagine if you meditated every day for 300 years, you know, imagine how much personal development that would bring, how much spiritual development.
Yeah, and all those books that you want to read and you feel you don't have time to get to, and you know that exactly. Leisurely you can read them when you want, you know. Which
it does make me think that, you know, they're now starting to introduce meditation into schools, and I think this is something that could be really fantastic, because if young people could sort of bypass the, you know, drinks, trying to be a grown up, the getting drunk, and the kind of having to get a job and settle down in a, you know, get relationships and actually concentrate on developing themselves first, that we would live in a much better society, I think.
I think that's very true. I think we should work on that with our new society when we set it up as well. Okay, I'm aware of time now. We've got about 5 minutes left, but one of the questions that is a really interesting one. How do you balance the two? You obviously write very, very popular books, and these books are really sell well and people really love them, but you're also an academic, so that's quite a balancing act, isn't it? I think
it is, yeah. But I was a writer before I was like an academic, so I think of myself primarily as a writer. And you know, I mean, partly it's a kind of practical thing because as I'm sure you're aware, it's quite a precarious existence as an author. So I've got 3 teenage boys to feed, so yeah. So being a part-time academic gives me a bit of financial stability, which helps. So I'm only part-time, so I wouldn't want to be a full-time academic. So I'm only 2.5 days a week, you know, so I got the rest of the week to do my writing. But also I do enjoy doing the research. You know, I have to do research as a part of my role. So it gives me the opportunity to do some really fascinating projects, such as the one on bereavement, which I think I mentioned earlier. I did a research project on the transformational effects of bereavement. And actually I wrote a book called The Leap 4 years ago. It's called The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And a lot of that was based on my research, you know, my academic research. So it's quite handy to, you know, to have my own research as a kind of, to provide the content of my books. But, you know, I think some academics do find it tricky to write in a popular format. You know, academics are kind of famously poor writers, and, you know, but obviously, and I try to write in a kind of accessible, popular style. I think some academics are afraid that if they write in, you know, if they write in an easy to understand way, then it will kind of diminish their credibility. So, but I don't care about that. Obviously, you know, I think that it's much more important to have a popular audience.
No, I was talking a couple of days ago to a friend of mine who will be on next week's show on synchronicities, Dr. Alan Roberts. And Alan Roberts and I were discussing this a couple of days ago, and he was saying that when he was doing his PhD, and he was writing in English literature, and he wrote his PhD on A Midsummer Night's Dream, I think it was, and he did his PhD thesis, or elements of his PhD thesis, and his tutor said, no, you've got to use bigger words, you've got to make it more obscure. And this is so frustrating, isn't it? You know, that obscurity proves your intellectual worth, whereas you're not getting your message across. You know, like,
it's ridiculous, really.
it's like your book. I mean, we haven't really got time to talk in great detail, but my favourite book of yours, I think, is The Fall. I really enjoyed that. You know, because it was such an interesting idea, and your writing is incredibly accessible, but incredibly deep as well. So it challenges you to think deeper about things, and I think that's the skill of being an academic, writing in a popularist style, and I think it's profoundly important. Now we're coming towards the end now, so Steve, what are the latest things? You've got your new book out and everything else. Is there anything else that you're working on at the moment? And then after you've explained that, if you can let people know, how can they contact you, how can they get hold of your books, your website? By the way, your website's fantastic. Website, everything else as well, so that people can contact you.
Well, yeah, I'm just pondering over my next project, which is probably going to be a book about time, actually, kind of like a revision of, not a revision, but kind of a continuation of my earlier book about time, focusing on my research into time expansion experiences. I want to explore that in more detail, looking into the connection between states of consciousness and time experiences, and also looking into the idea that you can experience the future in the present. So that will involve looking into quantum physics as well. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll probably start working on that later this year. And I write poetry too, so I'm always writing poems. I post them on my website, on my newsletter. In fact, my last book was a book of poetry called The Clear Light. So if people want to find out more about my work, they can go to my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V. Stephen M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. I'm also available on Facebook and Twitter, and I've just started a podcast, which is kind of slowly building up. I'm going to start work on that, do more work on my podcast over the coming months.
Excellent. This has been a simply wonderful chat. I really enjoyed it. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed when we last met. And how we spent the whole day chatting and going into seeing other people talk and going for coffee and chatting. It was absolutely wonderful. So, Steve, we must stay more in contact. There's so much synergy in what you're doing and what I'm doing, particularly in our fascination on time. So we must, Sarah, as I say, we must get Steve back for a longer chat, because we've only just scratched, as we always do, we've only just scratched the surface. So thanks, Steve, for that. For everybody else who's interested as well, in terms of the next show on Monday, we're going out live with Dr. Diane Hennessy-Powell, who is a neuroscientist based in America, who's been doing some fascinating research in precognition abilities of autistic children. You're going to love this one. It's going to be absolutely sensational. Really, really leading edge stuff. And then the following week on the 16th, we've got the Synchronicity event, where we're going to be doing an incon, which it will be like a coffee discussion between myself and Sarah and a few of our friends. And we'll be discussing about synchronicity. So that could be really, really exciting as well. We're going to be joined from Northern Ireland by Emma, who's a previous guest on here. Dr. Alan Roberts will be joining us. Dr. Jason Feitte will be joining us. Dr. Alan Roberts and Samantha Treasure will be joining us from South Korea. So that's going to be a really interesting chat. So please join in with that as well. Got lots of exciting stuff coming up in the future as well. So check it out. But Steve, thank you very much for being a wonderful guest. And as always, Sarah, thank you. Thanks, Steve. And Sarah, thank you very much for always your support. It's always appreciated, and I just love the new logo and the new symbolism as well, which is really good, which is really great. So until next time, this will be uploaded onto YouTube probably first thing tomorrow, hoping we've got the recording right. And please check it out there. Let people know about this. We want to make this the most enjoyable, most intellectually stimulating podcast available anywhere on the web. So please help us get it out there. As Steve and I said, let's call ourselves the third way, which is very Gurdjieffian, isn't it? It's in its sense, and Ospensky-like. But, you know, they were the fourth way, so we'll go for the third way. But let's try that and everything else as well. So, guys, thanks again for listening in. Without you, we couldn't be doing this job, this website as well. Sorry, this podcast. So anyway, thanks for listening in, and everybody else, and we'll see you all soon. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.